Good afternoon. I'm Mariana Mancuso, and I'm excited to welcome all of you to Ram Chat. Last week, we held our first ever Ram Chat, and the conversation did not disappoint. This afternoon's conversation is sure to be another you'll be talking about long after our Ram Chat is over. 7 months ago, America was under attack by domestic terrorists determined to overthrow democracy. Thanks to the brave men and women of the DC and Capitol Police who defended the US Capitol and our democracy from destruction. Today, co-founder of Renew America Movement and former Chief of Staff for Department of Homeland Security, Miles Taylor, will be speaking with a true American hero, Officer Michael Fanone. Fanone, who has a 20-year career in law enforcement, wasn't supposed to be at the Capitol on January 6th, but he heard the call about the attack, he put on his uniform and headed over to defend democracy from an insurrection. Weeks later, Officer Fanone would answer another call when he went before Congress to testify at Congress's January 6th Select Commission hearing about the events on January 6th. Without further ado, Miles, take it away.
Thanks, Mariana. I appreciate it. And let me just start off by saying, Officer Fanone, we're really grateful to have you here. I think everyone watching is grateful for your service. And I want to kick off on a bit of a personal note. I spent much of last year out on the campaign trail, trying to prevent Donald Trump from getting elected to a second term. Putting yourself out there publicly involves a willingness to take face shots, to just take face shots every single day. But you did something much harder than what I did, is you actually experienced the physical trauma of that day, but then you've decided to get out there publicly, even if it means continuing to take face shots, which I find admirable, and I think that is really true bravery. And I want to ask you, just to kick off, sir, what have the past 7 months been like? What's life been like since the insurrection?
Really, it's been like a life's worth of journey in a 7-month period. It's been isolating. It has been incredibly humbling and gratifying at times. It's been a roller coaster ride.
I imagine so. And I want to ask you, I definitely want to jump into not just the events we saw that day and the implications for the country, but you've experienced something that few Americans get to experience since, and that is the cacophony of the multitude. It's just so many people reaching out, some to praise you and some for reasons unknown to me as political partisans, to criticize you or question your story. What has your takeaway been about the state of discourse in our country, just from that experience and being on that roller coaster?
Yeah, I recognize that kind of the state of discourse in this country prior to January 6th. I saw how tribalistic things had become. It was incredibly just concerning to me, not just as a police officer, but just as an American, and even more importantly, as a father, because I know, my time on earth here is limited, and one day I'm going to, pass this country on, this world on to my children. I have 4 daughters, and it's certainly in the current state things we're in and are in. It was not what I wanted to turn over to them, and that was a big part of my inspiration for speaking out publicly after January 6th. It's sad. It's sad that people would politicize the experiences of police officers on January 6th simply because, it doesn't benefit them personally or doesn't benefit their political party.
So, Mike, I want you to take me back to January 6th first. I'm actually interested to hear about the days before that. As you remember all too well, after the election, tensions were pretty high in the Capitol. I think y'all over at, in law enforcement had worries about the potential for violence, What was that post-election period like? And did you have any inkling that something could get as bad as January 6th? What did that feel like at the time?
So as an American, I saw at least what I felt was a complete unraveling of the former president. The rhetoric that I heard coming from, from him and a lot of his supporters in the White House, in the government, I felt was dangerous, to say the least. As a police officer, I was aware of the significance of the rally. As a Metropolitan Police officer, we experienced those, what we call a First Amendment assembly, almost daily, if not daily. Somebody is protesting something at any point in time in Washington, D.C. And so, our department is well equipped to handle situations like that. And I knew that, we were taking it seriously because in the weeks leading up to January 6th, our deployment posture changed considerably. Officers were placed on 12-hour shifts for that week. Our civil disturbance units were called up and mobilized for that day, and also for the days leading up to and after January 6th. And those steps are not out of the ordinary for a large-scale political event. But some of the additional steps that were taken, like the canceling of leave, the canceling of days off, and also the canceling of officers who had prior leave for that week. Those steps are not often taken. And so clearly upper management felt like there was a potential for unrest, and those additional steps were taken by our department. That is the Metropolitan Police Department. Now, I work in narcotics, so I don't have anything to do with those types of deployments. When I came through the academy, which was almost 20 years ago, we didn't receive that training as part of a mandatory training for officers. And throughout my career, I avoided it like the plague. So, for me, January 6th was just going to be another working day. I had a plan already put in place to address a narcotics complaint which had come into our office that several other officers were working on by making a undercover drug buy with an informant. And that was what was on Mike Fanone's agenda for January 6th.
And certainly, officer, an insurrection against the U.S. Capitol was not on your agenda. We'll get to the day itself in a second. I find one thing striking, though, is that so many people since then have, feigned surprise. A number of politicians, primarily on one side of the aisle, briefly condemned it and expressed their shock. But to a lot of folks, it wasn't that surprising that violence erupted that day. In fact, I can remember at the time, I had to have a full-time armed security detail because of death threats. And the day of, my security detail had warned me, we should not be going downtown because there's a Stop the Steal rally and this thing could get very ugly. And these are private security guards, not folks in the government and law enforcement officers who are getting the latest intelligence. So I'm curious to hear from your perspective, was this unforeseeable as some people claimed, or was this a very predictable event and one that we probably could have headed off if more folks had paid attention?
Again, working in the specific field that I work in, at no point was I provided with some specific intelligence that said, January 6th is going to be an insurrection at the Capitol. That being said, clearly in what I just described, our department was aware of the significance of that day and the potential for violence. And that's evidenced by their security posture for the day. As a rank and file officer, we're not always made aware of specific threats or specific, issues that upper management may be aware of. But again, our security posture had changed dramatically. Now, just as a American, I knew through looking at different social media postings and some of the chatter that was, readily available for everyone to see. If you looked at Fox News or Breitbart or Newsmax or any other conservative online entities, you saw things like it's 1776 again, and we're going to retake our country and things like that. Now you have to balance that with the reality of the keyboard warriors that have emerged with some of these social media platforms. But at the same time, I had also witnessed, again, just as a American with 2 eyes and 2 ears, some of the other activities at other state capitals that had taken place in the weeks and months prior to January 6th, and that was concerning. Anytime you see a bunch of armed individuals storm into a state capitol, even if it is for what they determine is a political protest or claim as a political protest, that's of concern, just as an American.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. And I can remember in the days leading up to that, we'd had a number of those warnings, Mike, about, the potential for violence in state capitals. It was, tensions were running pretty high. And so the day of the insurrection itself, I'm curious, when in your mind, did things really start to break bad? When did you feel the adrenaline kick in and realize this is not just going to be a rally, this is rapidly becoming something else?
The adrenaline didn't start kicking in until I walked into the lower West Terrace tunnel. Prior to that, I remember, I think the first time it really came to my attention was my partner at the time, Jimmy Albright, contacted me, called me up on my cell phone and said that, hey, I'm getting text messages and calls from guys that are at work saying things are really kicking off at the Capitol. He lives out in, or lived at the time out in Deal, Maryland, which is outside of our radio range. And I'm in Alexandria. So he asked me to turn my radio on, see if I could hear anything. This was probably, I don't know, like around 1 p.m. And I could tell by the radio transmissions that, all hell had broken loose. And that's when the both of us made the determination to head into work. Our shift starts at 2:30, and we came in early. Coming over the 14th Street Bridge, I remember listening to, some of the replays of the political speeches from earlier that day, and then also from the former president's speech. And I knew, this is incitement. And it's going to be bad.
And you could feel that coming over the bridge and just listening to the coverage. Before even arriving on the scene, it was evident to you that there was clear connective tissue between the political rhetoric and the violence that we were seeing erupt.
Yeah, man. I said, in my testimony in Congress, I talked about, some of the most basic principles that law enforcement officers use to investigate potential crimes. And it's this, time, place, and circumstance. I knew the time, which was January 6th. And what happens on January 6th? Well, Congress convenes and they count the electoral votes and certify the presidential election. And where does that happen? It happens in Washington, D.C. in the Capitol building. So, you've got this group that was brought here under the, guise of a stop the steal, which is, was done in support of the president or former president. And clearly he was supportive of this because he spoke at the rally. And I don't know, like, how more clear a directive it could be than we're all going to go to the Capitol together. And that's what happened, minus the former president. But yeah, I mean, to me, if that had occurred like on a street corner somewhere in any other circumstance, the individual that that spoke those words would have been arrested, probably by me, for inciting a riot.
I can't imagine how difficult it is to continually, probably every single day, Officer Fanone, to be asked to go mentally back into that time period. And I won't ask you to recount the whole day. And I think you've done so very bravely publicly. But when you think back to the aftermath of it, you've spoken in pretty vivid terms about what it was like in the aftermath with you and fellow police officers leaving the scene. When did it occur to you in that point that you had just been attacked yourself? I mean, that you had suffered an attack and the country had suffered an attack. I'm sure at some point it was, look, this is a law enforcement operation to keep a rally from going out of control. But then you must have had a realization that, no, this has been an attack. What really struck you in that aftermath in the minutes and hours later?
So it really came into perspective while it was occurring. I remember, when I first walked up to the Capitol building, I could see large groups of, of rioters, and they were just kind of milling about, taunting, jeering, yelling. Once I entered the Lower West Terrace tunnel, and I saw this small group of officers, about 30 or 40 guys, really fighting for their lives. I realized that, the severity of the situation. And then once I was pulled out from that group of officers out into the crowd, that was the first time I realized how many goddamn people were there. I mean, it was just an endless sea of people on the west lawn of the Capitol. And, it was so surreal in seeing, thousands and thousands of these individuals, dressed in, military style gear, equipped with Kevlar vests and Kevlar helmets and gas masks, carrying various types of weapons, flags, with political slogans, clothing with political slogans, all in support of the former president. I mean, it was horrifying seeing that. It was unbelievable.
When you look back, some people have, of course, foolishly said it was a normal tourist visit in Washington. Of course, it looked nothing like a normal tourist visit. But, your job in going in there to assist wasn't just to protect the facility. It was to protect our country's leaders. I mean, the Vice President of the United States was within the complex, elected members of Congress, staff. When you went in and you saw the people, how they were dressed, how they were armed, I mean, did you think there are folks here that want to, kidnap or God forbid, even kill people on the premises? Did the scene feel like that at the time?
I mean, when I made my way down to the tunnel, it was readily apparent. And I talked about this again in my congressional testimony. When I say things, there's like, I wanted people to understand my thought process. When I said people were hell bent on, destruction and even murder. I mean, the destruction was evident, but the reason behind talking about individuals' motivations, which oftentimes police officers do not do unless you've conducted some type of an investigation. Well, my investigation was being pulled out into the crowd and beaten summarily, tased, and what I talked about was not, how I no longer was impeding their actions. Once I was out in the crowd, I was just simply trying to survive. I wasn't trying to stop anybody from doing anything other than kill me. And so, these individuals still continue to beat me relentlessly. And I very well could have died. And so to me, that shows the motivation of at least some of those individuals. I believe that their intention was to kill me. And so I don't think that it's a, foregone conclusion to say that, they would have, killed other individuals. If you're going to kill a cop, who's to say, you wouldn't kill a lawmaker?
Undoubtedly a harrowing experience, really one, Mike, that I think there aren't words for. I've got to applaud you again because, and a lot of our viewers, the thousands of folks tuning in online to this, many of whom are meeting you right now for the first time. Many have seen you on television in the past, but what I think a lot of folks don't grasp when they see someone on CNN or in the media is that these aren't people who were born to go be media personalities, aren't people who are seeking celebrity. I don't think you woke up on January 6th and said, I want to go spend the next few months doing interviews and on the cover of Time magazine. It may seem glorious to the outsider, but that's not what this is. There's not glory and celebrity in this. You suffered a real thing, and speaking out publicly is exceptionally difficult to do, and it involves bringing your whole family, your 4 daughters, your extended family into a spotlight that no one asked for on January 5th or the morning of January 6th. So I really want to put a direct question to you. You're a regular guy. You probably drink beers and barbecue and spend time with your family. Life changed dramatically in the past 7 months. Why? Why speak out? Why have you continued to highlight these issues? What motivates you to be out there explaining not just what happened that day, but what it means for us as a country? What's motivating you to do it?
Well, first and foremost, my initial motivation was some of the media reports, the initial media reports, which suggested that officers were much more reserved in their use of force or the way that they handled the protest in relation to the summertime unrest with the George Floyd protest and the Black Lives Matter movement, which I knew from firsthand experience to be unequivocally false. I understand why those reports were made, and I think in some respect the law enforcement community bears responsibility because we're not always as transparent as we probably should be. That's not to say that, every police department should start putting their version of Mike Fanone out there in the public eye. But in this particular instance, I was infuriated. And, I wanted people to understand that, we only made several handfuls of arrests that day because we were busy fighting for our lives. And this really wasn't a law enforcement operation anymore. This was more of a military style defense of a physical structure. And our job was to try to repel this attack and keep the members of Congress, their staff, and ourselves safe and alive. So that was the main focus of our efforts on January 6th. Then I saw a complete lack of acknowledgement for the officers that fought on that day. And, here I am sidelined with, at the time, were some significant physical injuries. As a result of the assault on me, I suffered a traumatic brain injury, a heart attack, and then later suffered from PTSD. To me, it was like, this is something that I could do while other officers continue to go to work day in and day out. I could talk about what happened that day, bring it into the public eye, and maybe we would get some acknowledgement for these officers. Unfortunately, that still really has not come in what I would, humbly deem as an acceptable form.
Well, to that end, Mike, what's been the greatest disappointment?
Seeing so many officers suffer silently when I think it would go such a long way for those individuals to be acknowledged publicly. We talk about it all the time, like police officers, members of the military. We don't do our jobs for medals and acknowledgement. But in some circumstances, that's warranted. And that's why we have those types of things. And so a big part of my mission at the time was to get that acknowledgement for these officers, especially the ones that, weren't fortunate like me to get their picture in the paper or have a bunch of media attention, which, hasn't all been rainbows and unicorns. But, to them, they see me out there like in the public eye. But they also, they haven't had the benefit of the outreach and support that I've received. I mean, I've gotten thousands of letters and emails and phone calls from people that, are incredibly grateful for all of our service. And it's hard to convey that to each and every one of those officers. So that, that acknowledgement would have gone a long way. And then came the whitewashing. And that really kind of morphed my motivations from, clarifying what happened that day in the media, and then acknowledgement for officers. And then all of a sudden, like, I'm in charge of correcting politicians that are trying to erase the memory of January 6th. And in doing so, causing a great deal of pain and distress, not just to the officers that served, but also to their families. And really to everyone in this country. I've talked to, thousands of people. In a lot of ways, this was like 9/11. Everybody was traumatized by what they saw on January 6th, not just those of us that were physically present. A good friend of mine who's been very inspirational in all of this, a guy named Justin Laskett, who served in the military overseas, was severely injured. I spoke to him one night, and I told him that I have a real difficult time telling him about my experiences when he suffered so much more physically than I have. And he told me, Mike, trauma is trauma. It's not about comparison. And that really resonated with me because there's a lot of officers that say the same thing to me. They have a difficult time telling me about, their pain and the things that they're dealing with. And even just everyday Americans, people that I've spoken to that all over the country and all over the world that watched it, and they feel like it's out of place for them to tell me how traumatized they were. But we all were. I mean, we saw a physical attack on our country that was, at least in part motivated and inspired by and incited by members of our own government. How horrifying is that? And then it continues to this very day. For whatever their individual motivations, we have, government officials, elected officials who continue to, push this garbage rhetoric to raise money for political campaigns and to pander to voters.
Mike, I like you've spent a lot of your career working on counter drug. Before all of this, politics wasn't my plan either. I spent most of it on counterterrorism, and it's eerie to me to see how similar some of the trends that we saw when we were fighting Al Qaeda and ISIS were to how we saw some of this domestic terrorism threat evolve in this country. And a lot of it starts really on misinformation. I mean, you look at ISIS and Al Qaeda, it starts with lies, propaganda, and misinformation. In the lead up to January 6th, we clearly saw a lot of that. We saw a lot of misinformation about the security of the election translate into, grievances that people felt like they couldn't express through the political process, which is exactly what foreign terrorist organizations do. They say, look, the process itself doesn't work. You got to go attack the underlying institutions. And then we saw that happen here as people say, look, the process was broken. You got cheated. Now go attack the institutions. And we saw the insurrection. But it didn't stop there. Those lies and misinformation, as you know, continued. In fact, even with regard to you specifically, there's been far-right commentators who suggested that you, sir, are an actor and you were a trauma or crisis actor who faked this for some sort of political reason. Now, I hope that folks watching can recognize that Mike Fanone is not an Oscar-winning actor. He's a genuine human being. But do you think that misinformation contributed to the attacks on January 6th? And how do you forecast the impact on public safety going forward of that sort of propaganda and misinformation continuing to be spread in mass and not just in small conspiracy theorist circles?
Yeah, I mean, therein lies like the big problem, I guess, with these social media platforms. The spread of and sharing of information is, by and large, I think, a positive thing. Unfortunately, you have people out there that harness that for, I don't think there's any other term to use other than just evil. The attacks against me, I don't know. I've been a police officer for 20 years. Like I'm accustomed to taking, some verbal assaults, and it really doesn't bother me. I think I talked about it. I did an interview CNN where I said I feel, incredibly comfortable when defense attorneys resort to theatrical tactics because I know that they don't have any facts to support whatever argument that they're trying to make. The problem with that is while it might not bother me, it inspires others who believe this as truth, and then oftentimes the threats, whether they're directed at me or other officers who've spoken out publicly, you'll hear snippets of that rhetoric included in their threats, and you realize like, well, while this person might just be a kind of a political pundit type jackass, that there's some guy out there or some gal out there that takes that very seriously and thinks that me or these other individuals are true enemies of our democracy, and that somehow I'm threatening their very existence. and then it becomes incredibly dangerous.
In your mind, given the state of political discourse in this country, could this happen again? Do you see a risk of something like this in some way, shape, or form happening again?
I do. Unfortunately, yes. I mean, that was another surprise to me, just as an American. You know, I thought post January 6th, that was kind of an off ramp to the direction that we had been traveling. You know, we were on like a highway to hell, so to speak. And, you know, maybe this would provide us the, you know, motivation to take the first exit. But instead, we, you know, some members of our government decided to like double down on this insanity. And here we are. So, yeah, I think we're, unfortunately, things have not gotten much better.
You know, Mike, I'm a lifelong Republican. I have no idea what your political leanings are, and frankly, don't even care because I think it's entirely irrelevant. If Americans can put their politics aside from this, whatever they felt about Donald Trump, whoever they voted for, however they feel about Joe Biden, if they can put their politics aside, what's your message to the American people about how we stop something like this from happening again? What do we need to be doing? I mean, the citizen who's listening to you in Peoria, Illinois, or Sacramento, California, what do they need to be thinking about as a country and as a community so that we can stop this from escalating to what we saw on January 6th?
Well, I think first and foremost, you know, as individual Americans, you know, the one thing that we have is the ability to vote. People need to take that, you know, incredibly seriously. Think about who it is that they're voting for, what type of candidates. You know, if you're someone who is like a diehard Republican or a diehard Democrat who only supports, you know, those candidates, fine. I'm more of a, you know, a la carte type of a guy, but you know, who is it that your party is, you know, putting in place to run to represent you? People need to be much more cognizant of the power of that vote. You know, is this a person who's running on a platform of, you know, angry, vitriol rhetoric, or is it someone who has real policies that are going to benefit them, or you know, are in line with their morals and ethics? We also need to hold those politicians accountable, become much more engaged, I think, in the day-to-day political process, calling them up, you know, when they do something we don't like, but also calling them up when we do something that they do like, you know, providing them with that level of guidance on an individual level. I think that oh, that's a tricky question.
Well, let me ask you this, Mike. You know, as Americans are trying to figure out how to still grapple with that day, you know, Congress punted when it came to something that I believe you supported strongly, which was a commission, a bipartisan commission to look into the insurrection on January 6th. Instead, the Speaker of the House, you know, has formed a select committee, a bipartisan select committee to do that investigation. What burning questions do you still have about that day that you hope the select committee answers? And perhaps more broadly, what would your charge be to those members of Congress who are leading that investigative effort?
I mean, what I like kind of harped on in my testimony was just I was looking for a mechanism which would bring about or expose the truth. And, again, we've already had quite a few investigations, some that are still ongoing as to, first of all, the criminal activities that took place that day that were limited to those individuals that, may have breached the Capitol, committed assaults, things of that nature. We've also had, the Senate investigation into some of the security failures that day, training protocols, force mobilization, and things that resulted in, law enforcement being overwhelmed and ultimately the Capitol being breached. What I was looking for from the bipartisan committee or the select committee is that, an investigation into those elected leaders and, their staff members, to what degree were they communicating with some of the more organized elements of the, mob that day? Was there, some mechanism for funding those individuals? When you have a massive amount of people, while I'm sure there were grassroots participants that just were inspired to show up, I've also seen evidence of some organization. So there was there funding made available for those groups? Where did that funding come from? Is it connected to, in any way, any of our elected leaders, their staff members? Those are the questions that I want answered.
Well, Mike, my final question for you would be this: you've borne a lot of the trauma of that day personally. You've talked about it candidly to the American people. My friends call me Mr. Brightside because I always kind of try to look for the silver lining. And I'm curious, despite the trauma, despite really a lot of the dark clouds that you've had to try to part to get through the past 7 months, what's been the silver lining for you? What gives you hope about everything since that day that you've experienced?
I mean, I've seen and heard from thousands upon thousands of Americans and even people across the world who recognize and are incredibly alarmed at what's going on, and whom they see, I've talked a lot about having compassion and empathy for individuals, and that has resonated with them, and that's been incredibly humbling. A big part of this for me has been the fact that, I'm a regular, average, probably a below average human being. And any one of us, could take a stand against injustice. And if you just tell the truth about your experience, which is all I've ever done, that you can have a massive impact and effect on, not just your immediate community, but, the greater community at large. And I'm incredibly humbled by that. And I'm proud of what I've done and what I've been able to accomplish. But I'm also incredibly grateful for this experience. As traumatic as it was on January 6th, it's allowed me to, to experience some incredible, pretty amazing things, and some incredible, amazing people.
Well, Officer Fanone, before I turn it back over to Mariana, look, I speak for the Republicans, the Democrats, the Independents, the I don't know what I ams that are tuned in today. We want to thank you not just for protecting the U.S. Capitol on that day as part of the D.C. Metropolitan Police and coming to the aid of the U.S. Capitol Police, and for protecting our elected representatives, but honestly, for what you just said, for your willingness to speak up and speak the truth. That takes a whole hell of a lot of courage. And hopefully that is something that everyday Americans will take to heart and do in their own lives. So thank you, sir. You've been an incredible example in that regard. Mariana, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miles. And thank you, Officer Fanone, for an incredible conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. If you enjoyed this conversation, you're going to love next week's Ram Chat. I'll be sitting down with another true American hero, a decorated military member who was in the room where it happened on the infamous call between Trump and the newly elected Ukrainian President Zelensky. Afterwards, he made the courageous decision to speak up and remind the world that in America, here, right matters. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman will join me and Miles to discuss his book, Here, Right Matters. I hope you'll join us next Thursday, September 2nd at 7 p.m. for a Ram Chat with Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. In the meantime, to stay up to date with everything Renew America Movement is doing and how you can tune in for our next Ram Chat or even watch last week's episode, be sure to follow us on Twitter at Renew America, subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Renew America Movement, and sign up on our website for all the latest information, renewamericamovement.com. Have a fantastic rest of your week, and we'll chat soon.